I'm so pleased to be at Yale, and especially to be at this interdisciplinary, with this interdisciplinary group, which is very, very dear to my heart, putting together philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, computation. And let me just say a word. Someone asked me to start out by saying something about the path that brought me here, especially for the students in the audience. And I started out as a complete 100% full-time philosopher. That was the thing that I most wanted to do. When I was about 10 years old, I saw a play, Barefoot in Athens, on television with Peter Ustinov playing Socrates, and I thought that was the most wonderful thing that I'd ever seen. I think I forgot the point about how he gets killed in the end. I just thought the fact that you were allowed to argue as much as you wanted was like complete heaven. I try not to, well, no, I do try to encourage that in my grandchildren, not in my children so much, but in my grandchildren. And my father, in typical fashion, went and gave me the little Plato, the paperback of Plato's dialogues with a Raphael picture on the front. I remember it to this day. And I started reading it, and I thought it was fantastic. I was so pleased. And as a 10-year-old, I was very interested in immortality. All 10-year-olds are really interested in immortality. So I read the Phaedo, which is Plato's wonderful argument about immortality. And Plato makes this argument that there must be a way that you could extend over time, that it couldn't be that you just have a soul that just lives in for a short period, so then that leads him to think about past lives. And I can remember at 10, the other thing to know about me was that I was the oldest of 6 children, and the oldest girl of 6 children, which meant that I was essentially a surrogate, very much to my benefit, was very much a surrogate parent. And I read it and I thought, why doesn't he say anything about children? It's so obvious that the way that you continue is through having children and educating them and the fact that they live on after you're gone. And yet there just wasn't any word anywhere in that whole argument about children. You wouldn't know that people had children. And that is true about philosophy in general. So I looked in the 1967 Encyclopedia of Philosophy when I wrote my book, The Philosophical Baby. Just look up references to mothers, fathers, children. There are 6 references in the 1967 Encyclopedia of Philosophy, many more to angels. Angels do much better than children in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now that's really changed, and I like to think that I and my colleagues have been part of that change. And that's really what I set out to do. That's what I wanted to do for my whole career, was to say, here's these deep, important philosophical questions, and here's this deep, important, fundamental part of human nature, both biologically, morally, psychologically, which is that we have children and we have parents and we raise those children, and we should be using that deep, important fact about us as a way of understanding these big philosophical questions. And that's really been the whole basis of my career. When I got to Oxford doing philosophy, it turned out that I had actually done enough courses in psychology when I graduated from McGill. I was just 20 and I had started at 15, that's another story, that I could get a degree in psychology as well. So I had both philosophy and psychology, but I was completely a philosopher. I went to Oxford to do philosophy. But also Jerome Bruner, the great developmental psychologist, was there. So I was spending half my time in Oxford down in Logic Lane, which is near the Thames, where the high prestige parts of Oxford are. In Logic Lane, listening to what turned out to be a famous philosophy seminar. And then I was spending the other half, they park the women and children as far away from the Central University as possible in Oxford. So I was spending the rest of the time up north in Summertown, crawling around on the floor with 18-month-olds. And after a little while, I realized that I could spend the rest of my life with one of 2 communities of thinkers, either this community of completely disinterested seekers after truth who just wanted to solve the deepest problems of the universe, or this community of whiny, egocentric, spoiled creatures who needed to have women take care of them all the time. And since the first group was the babies and the second group was the philosophers, that's why I ended up spending the rest of my life with babies instead of philosophers. A last thing to say is that of all those philosophical questions, I think there's lots of philosophical questions maybe all of them where children are extremely relevant, but the one that I really cared about the most and have cared about for my entire career is what you might call the problem of knowledge. The problem of knowledge is, again, goes back to Plato and Aristotle, is that we seem to have structured, hierarchical, abstract knowledge of the world around us. We know about tables and chairs, and in science we know about leptons and quarks, but all that actually reaches us from the world is a stream of photons hitting our eyes and disturbances of air at our ears. How is it that we can ever learn as much as we do about the world as accurately as we do from that, what looks like very different, degenerate, weak kinds of information and data? And as I say, this goes back to Plato and Aristotle, and going back to Plato and Aristotle, the two kinds of solutions to that have been either to think, it just looks as if we're getting it from the data, it was there all along, that's the Plato solution, the Chomsky solution, the core knowledge solution, or else to say, it just looks as if we have all this abstract structure. It's really just accumulations of the data. It's really just accumulations of the specific information we have, which is the Aristotle solution, the Locke solution, the connectionist solution, the kind of deep learning solution. And I think for people who actually study babies and children, neither of those solutions seems very satisfactory. Because when we look at kids, we seem to see both that from very early, even from infancy, they've got this kind of abstract hierarchical structured knowledge of the world, but also that they revise it and change it and learn it from the data. And that problem, how could you ever possibly do that? I think that's one of the deepest, most important problems in cognitive science. And it's an interesting problem because, of course, children are the people we know who do that the best and the most spontaneously and the most effectively, as I'll say during my talk. But it's actually also a problem that's central to vision science, it's central to machine learning, it's central to philosophy of science, it's central to, so there's this set of disciplines that you wouldn't usually think of in the same breath, right? Machine learning, psychophysics, perceptual psychology, vision science, epistemology, philosophy of science, and developmental psychology, cognitive development. But all of them are trying to answer that question. And what I've been doing in my career as well is to try and bring together the solutions that come from all of those different areas. And I'm going to talk about some of that, a specific example of that today. Okay. Okay, let me start out by saying that in spite of my being snooty about people not having paid attention to children, here's a really interesting exception to this, which is that in that very first the very first famous paper in mine, in which Alan Turing first describes the imitation game as the criterion for whether an artificial system could actually be intelligent or not. We all know about the imitation game, the Turing test, and of course, to some extent, LLMs are getting to the point where they're almost ready to pass that test, where you might not be able to tell in a conversation that they were not human. But in that very paper, halfway through, Turing changes his mind. And he says, maybe this whole Turing test is a bad idea. Maybe instead of trying to simulate the adult mind, instead we should try to produce a system that simulates the child's. And the reason why Turing says that is because summarizing adult knowledge, which again is essentially what current large models do, isn't the same thing as actually learning that knowledge from the world around you. And that's the thing that the children can do. So it's not just that the children have the knowledge, it's that they actually have learned it from their experience of the world. And that's a big difference, and Turing recognizes that that's a big difference in intelligence. And if you have capacities to learn knowledge from the world, what that means is that when the world changes, when the environment changes, you can change your knowledge as well. And that's the great thing that that's the great capacity that children have. So for the past 20 years or so, I've been collaborating with computationalists, trying to see, could we design an artificial system that learns in the way that children do? And vice versa, could we use understanding a system like that to understand how it is that children can learn as much as they do? And I'm going to talk about just a few of the kind of morals that come when you try to think about an artificial system, a system that could solve this problem from the lens of what we know about biological childhood. So here's the first thing that children can teach us about AI. When I give these talks in Silicon Valley, I like to put this up. You can see it's got really big font, and there's a sharp intake of breath from my audience, and they all whisper, "Don't tell the VCs, don't tell the VCs." The idea that there is such a thing as general intelligence. Now, I think there's a whole other talk to give about why that's such a pervasive idea. There's a sort of picture, there's this kind of magic substance, and you can have a little of it or you can have a lot of it, and if you have a lot of it, then you're more powerful, and you should get more investment and money and authority in the society. But the truth is that from a developmental cognitive science perspective, we just don't, there's just not anything like that that shows up, right? So if you're actually trying to understand how children learn, there might be a little bit of, test taking psychometrics in the corner, but that's not at all what it is that we're doing when we're trying to figure out the intelligence of children. And one of the things that you realize is that not only are there diverse, different kinds of intelligences, but it's not just that there's, emotional intelligence or physical intelligence. There are actually trade-offs among these different intelligences. And one thing that actually, oddly enough, comes from computer science itself is the idea that there are cognitive capacities that can't both be maximized at the same time. And I'm going to talk some more about one in particular, the explore-exploit trade-off. But the idea is that different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of cognitive capacities actually are in tension with one another. Now, the kind of intelligence that is most commonly thought of as intelligence, perhaps, that people in AI, for instance, study the most is perhaps, with nice assonance, but a little meanly called exploitation in the computer science literature. That's the ability to go out and have goals and achieve those goals and to set yourself a problem and figure out how to solve that problem, to get reward, to function well in the world. And that's been, in some sense, the kind of intelligence that's most relevant for grown-ups. It's been very relevant to AI, for example. But I want to talk about three different kinds of intelligences, three different kinds of cognitive capacities, and I think there are many others as well. But the ones I want to talk about today are what I'll call exploration and care/transmission. So in exploration, what you're trying to do is figure out about the world. In care, you're trying to take care of other agents. And in transmission, you're trying to get information from one generation or one person to another. And these various capacities, as I'll argue, are actually in tension with one another. So you can't maximize all of them at the same time. How do you solve that problem of those trade-offs? I think there's lots of different ways that different creatures may solve it. But the way that humans seem to solve it, and one way that biology seems to solve it very often, is through what biologists call life history. And I've been sort of an evangelist for life history within developmental psychology. I think it's a really, really beautiful idea that comes from evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology. What's life history about? Well, life history is about the way that a species develops. So how many children it has, how long it lives, how much investment it has in its children. And if you imagine an Alpha Centauran biologist coming to Earth during the Pleistocene, when there were lots of different primates, scrambling around on the veldt, and trying to say what's distinctive about this one, the Homo sapiens, they probably wouldn't see giant differences in theory of mind or in tool use. We know that chimpanzees, for example, have various kinds of versions of those capacities. Maybe language would be a difference. But what would really strike this biologist, especially assuming that Alpha Centaurans were really advanced good biologists, was that the humans had this incredibly bizarre life history. That bizarre life history is summarized in this picture where you can see there's 3 children under, these of course are one set of my grandchildren. There's 3 children under the age of 5 in that picture. And those children are pretty much completely helpless. I mean, even Augie, the 5-year-old, needs someone to take care of him all the time. And we are helpless, human children are helpless for much longer than those of any other species. So by the time a chimp is just a little older than Augie, about 7, a chimp is producing as much food as he's consuming. So he's taking care of himself. And With humans, my son is 35, and but certainly 5-year-olds are not producing as much food as they're consuming. Even worse, they have these incredibly hungry brains that are using up vast amounts of calories just to do the connections that they're going to do much more than adults. Okay, so on top of that, we have much shorter interbirth intervals than other creatures. So chimps are typically having a baby about once every 3 or 4 years. Humans have babies about once every 2 years. And that you can see that with these babies here. So we stack up even more of those hungry, helpless babies. And then we have another really distinctive feature of our life history, which is that you can see that lurking behind those beautiful babies is a postmenopausal grandmother. And postmenopausal grandmothers are another unique feature of humans. So as we'll see in a minute, there's one other species we know of that actually has postmenopausal grandmothers, but of course it's a bit contradictory. Why would women be living for 20 years or so after menopause? And women have always lived for 20 years or so after menopause. So we have this really weird life history, this very strange life history. Why do we have this strange life history? And how is this life history related to our other capacities, our capacities for our very large brains, our capacities for intellect, for tool use, et cetera, et cetera. And what I want to argue is that that life history enables this trade-off between multiple kinds of intelligence across developmental periods. So that what happens is you have adults who are designed to get resources, to exploit, to solve problems, to accomplish goals. But then you have children who are a distinctive group with distinctive neural characteristics, with distinctive motivational, affective characteristics. And they are really designed to explore. They're really designed to figure out what the environment is like. And it's that figuring out what the environment is like that enables them to do all the exploitation as adults. And then we have a third category, which is that, as we'll see, if you're going to be doing all that exploring, you need someone to take care of you. And of course, parents take care of children. But I think there's a good argument that elders those postmenopausal grandmothers really are deeply, deeply involved in care. And I'll talk about that for elders in general. And the other characteristic that's distinctively human is that we're a cultural species. So we transmit information from one generation to another. And I think there's also evidence that elders, those postmenopausal grandmothers, the singers in my case, of old Broadway show tunes and nursery rhymes and stories, that those elders are actually the locus of that kind of cultural transmission. And as I say, all of these intelligences push against one another. So if you're exploring, you're finding out new things about the world, that's going to be different from trying to transmit the things that you already know, or even being able to imitate the things that you already know, which in turn is going to be different from exploitation. So what I'm going to do is talk first about exploration in childhood, and then I'm going to talk about care, and then I have 2 slides at the end about AI that will just be pointing to other kinds of work. Okay, so first of all, let's think about this claim about exploration. One of the things that we and other developmental psychologists have worked on for many years is the idea of the child as scientist. That's become one of the prevailing views about cognitive development. I'd be willing to say the prevailing view, that what children are doing is going out into the world, building intuitive theories of the world, figuring out how the world works, just in their normal everyday development. And this is true of infants and preschoolers, maybe especially true of infants and preschoolers. Well before school or education or other interventions like this. And one of the really important, crucial things that goes on in theory formation is causal learning, figuring out the causal structure of the world, figuring out what causes what. And this is a review paper in Nature Reviews recently. And by now there's a really enormous body of work showing that even very, very young children are amazingly adept at inferring causal structure. You can just give them a simple you can give them a simple causal problem to solve, you can give them data about that problem, and they will find the right solution to that problem. Now, you might be a bit surprised at this, because when you ask adults things like, what's the relationship between this does this pattern of conditional probability indicate an unobserved confounder or not, they are not typically terribly smart about it. But we don't do anything as stupid as asking kids questions like that. What we do instead is to use things like our Blicket detector. In this day and age, it turns out to be a very good thing that the Blicket detector costs about $10.99. This is our one crucial piece of equipment. This is a little box that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it and not others, and we have a bunch of other toys like this. And what we can do is show children the actual data, show them the patterns of dependency that show up in this machine, and then we can ask the children which ones are Blickets, can you make the machine go? We can ask the children to actively show that they've understood the causal structure of the machine. And using those kinds of techniques, we've figured out all the things that are in this review paper. But there's a kind of interesting question, which is, all right, we've shown that these children are doing it, and we've shown that they can do it in a Bayesian kind of way, that they're considering hypotheses, considering the data that would be generated from those hypotheses, and then using the data to figure out the probability of hypotheses. This is a very general sort of Bayesian turn in cognitive science that this work has been part of. But there's still this problem about how do they actually search through all those hypotheses to find an answer. And it turns out that from a computational perspective, doing this kind of inference is incredibly challenging. It's very hard to figure out how you actually do it. How do you actually learn that abstract structure, causal structure from the data? That causal inference problem is a big, deep problem in philosophy of science and in computation. And that's the problem that I'm thinking about trying to approach now, and that I'll be trying to talk about in this paper. We know that they do it, but how is it possible for them to do it? And one idea is something that we should really have figured out to begin with. The kids were sort of telling us this, because when we started doing the Blicket detector experiments, the biggest problem with the Blicket detector was keeping the kids away from it. So we had to say to the kids, okay, you'll get to play with it after I've finished doing my test, then you can play with it, but you can't, now you just have to look at what I'm doing and see what the outcomes are. And that should have been a clue to us that for the kids' perspective, exploration was really the way that they were going to solve the problem. What they really wanted to do was experiment on the Blicket detector and do things to figure out how it worked. And in fact, there's been a bunch of really beautiful experiments, which I think I have this in another slide, including by Laura Schultz, who's Julian and Julia's advisor, showing in detail how when children are just spontaneously experimenting, they do it very naturally, and they do it in a way that gives them a lot of data. So we know that children actually are doing this. But again, in the computational literature, the problem of what's called active learning, how is it that you don't just sit there and take in a whole bunch of data, but actually go out and get data for yourself, is very challenging. It's very hard to get a good computational account of that kind of active learning, that kind of experimentation. And oddly enough, the same thing's true in philosophy of science. Even though we all think a randomized controlled experiment is the gold standard for causal inference, there isn't a good theory about how do you decide which experiment to do. There's all these things that you might do. How do you decide which experiments are going to be the right ones to bring about particular kinds of outcomes? And indeed, in the computational literature, in the literature on things like reinforcement learning, there's this explore-exploit trade-off that I mentioned before, where being able to go out and do these experiments, explore, get information from the world, is provably in tension with acting on the world effectively to get rewards. In the reinforcement learning literature, a very basic problem, for instance, is you have what's called a multi-arm bandit. You have two levers you can push. One of them gives you a reward with a certain probability. The other one has a much lower probability of giving you the reward. So you stick to just pulling the lever that will get you the most reward. But of course, maybe something's changed. Maybe the contingencies are different now. So you should really sometimes try the thing that isn't going to be rewarding, because that's going to tell you about the environment. And the puzzle is, how do you resolve this tension between, I'm just going to do the thing that's getting me the most reward now that is accomplishing my goals, and going out and trying to figure out as much as you can about how the environment works and how you can, what the potential of the environment is. And from that perspective, many things that have traditionally been seen as being being bugs of childhood cognition turn out to actually be features from an explorer perspective. So the fact that children are noisy, both literally and metaphorically, that they have a lot of randomness, that they take risks, that they're impulsive, that they spend all their time playing instead of working. That's kind of like that's the definition of play, is the explore side of the explore-exploit trade-off, that they have this insatiable curiosity. All those things that are characteristic of children are not great if you want someone, just to take an example, to put on their snowsuit and get out to preschool. But they're really great if you want a creature that can learn as much about the world as humans actually do, or at least that's the argument that I'm going to make. And we actually know that to go back to the Alpha Centauran biologist, we know that across species, there's this striking, very, very general relationship between the size of an adult brain, how anthropomorphically smart the adult animal is, and how long a period of childhood there is. And this is true for mammals, it's true for birds, it's even true for insects, and there's some arguments that it might be true for plants, that this long developmental period is connected with being able to learn more about the environment. And chickens and crows are the great classic example of that difference. Yeah?
Could you help me understand what you mean by trade-off? I understand what it means in the reinforcement learning example.
Right.
You're saying that for different people, like he may be better at exploring intelligence, right? And I'm better at exploitation intelligence. Are you saying that for the same person, we have this trade-off across different developmental stages?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And here's the summary of it. So what I'm arguing is that you could think about childhood as being evolution's way of resolving explore-exploit trade-offs. A more technical way of thinking about it that I could talk about is it's evolution's way of doing simulated annealing. It gives you this, one of the things that so how do you solve this trade-off? Well, if you look in the computer science literature, what you see is that very often the best strategy is start out by exploring. You can see why that would be true. Get a general picture of what your environment is like, and then once you've got the picture of what the environment is like, then you can narrow into exploit. And that's a standard practice. The way that it's often instantiated is you start off with this very high temperature, what's called a high temperature search. You look around a lot, you bounce around from one solution to another, you're doing a lot of random things, and then you gradually cool off to a much narrower search. So if you want to think about noisy, hot, bouncy, out of the box people that you know, they're more likely to be 3 than they are to be 33. So what I've argued in some detail is that we could think of childhood as evolution's way of doing simulated annealing and solving the explore-exploit tension. You get this early period when you're protected. Now, of course, there's a catch, as we'll see, to this idea, which is that that while you're in this exploratory period, you're not exploiting, so somebody else has to be feeding you peanut butter sandwiches and making sure that you don't kill yourself trying to poke things into the plugs. But it does have the advantage that then you've got this kind of pure period for exploration. And I think this is particularly going to be true if you're in a non-stationary environment or an out-of-distribution situation, which of course is exactly the situation that humans are in all the time. And that's the situation where things like LLMs characteristically break down. I can talk about that a little more too. And in fact, most of the time if you give grown-ups and children a task, the grown-ups will do better because they're better at all these exploit skills, attention, focus, etc. But when the task involves this sort of out-of-the-box going against what you already think, there are a whole lot of examples of cases where children are actually doing better than adults, including work that I've done and work that other people have done. My personal favorite, sadly, is not from my lab, but from Charlie Wu's lab, that last one, where Charlie showed that, in fact, developmental changes look like this simulated annealing. They look like the change from a high-temperature random search to a more narrow search from a technical perspective. Okay, So that's kind of a summary of where we were, but there's still this problem about what is a mechanism that would enable this kind of wide-ranging exploration. Even if you think that it's what children are designed to do, how do they do it, and how do they do it effectively to figure out the world around them? And the new idea comes from a very different source of information about learning. So, everything I've talked to you about so far comes from this sort of intuitive theory formation, Bayesian hypothesis testing, picture of the world. But of course, a very important other kind of learning is reinforcement learning, and that's become more and more important in the last few years in neuroscience and computation. It's responsible for AlphaGo and chess. And I have to say, as a boomer cognitive scientist, when reinforcement learning first made its comeback, I was sort of horrified. I was sort of thinking, my God, we're going to go back to the 50s to operant conditioning. Didn't Chomsky get rid of all that in 1965? We're going to have to wear bell bottoms next. I was sort of worried. I gave this talk, and a young student came up to me afterwards and said, but bell bottoms are fun. Like, everybody wears bell bottoms. But what I've increasingly come to think is that reinforcement learning, there's a really interesting bridge between reinforcement learning and the kind of Bayesian causal learning, especially the kind of Bayesian exploration that I've been talking about. And reinforcement learning, you could think of people like the philosopher Jim Woodward have pointed this out as a very narrow kind of causal learning. So the big puzzle that I have is, how could you ever learn about the causal structure of the world? We know that kids do that. How could they do that? Well, reinforcement learning is kind of like a very narrow form of that, because what's happening is an agent is performing an intervention, they're acting on the world, and then they're seeing the outcomes of that action. So if what you want to know is, how can you act on the world to get information about the world? That's this kind of exploration question. Then in a way, something like that might be going on abstractly in reinforcement learning. But of course, in classical reinforcement learning, there's no models. You're not actually getting a model of the way the world works. All that's happening is that you're increasing the probability that you'll produce the action. And the outcomes, so the actions are just narrowly the agent's own actions, and the outcomes are utilities, and that's the way you decide about the outcomes. And that doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that could capture the kind of generalized causal learning that we see in kids. But interestingly, the people in reinforcement learning have recognized this problem, and in particular, that explore-exploit trade-off comes up exactly out of the reinforcement learning literature that has really emphasized this, because it's very hard to resolve that tension if you're just thinking about classical reinforcement learning. And a way that people have tried to approach this is by saying, well, how about if instead of having these utility rewards, like you're not getting shocked or you're getting cheese, instead you have epistemic rewards. So suppose instead you think about having intrinsic rewards, like you want information gain instead of just having a utility. You want to gain more information, or you want to find things that are new that you haven't already seen, or all the sort of things that come out of curiosity. And there's been some really interesting work, both in computation and in development, trying to see what happens when you give a system those kinds of rewards instead of the kind of classical rewards. The problem is when you use these kind of, and there's, by the way, work showing that even by my colleague Celeste Kidd, showing that even infants are looking to try to do something like get information gain. The problem with those kinds of rewards is that they're also overly broad. So the classic problem with this kind of something like information gain is what's called the noisy TV problem, another boomer reference. In the olden days, there used to be that the TVs would have lots of static late at night. And static will give you a lot of information gain in the technical sense. You're finding out something new all the time. There's something that's unpredictable that's happening. But it doesn't feel like paying attention to random things that are going on in the environment, as we'll see in a minute, is going to be very helpful for actually learning. It might be partly helpful, but it doesn't seem to be giving you things that would be important for causal learning, for example. But there's another epistemic idea for an intrinsic motivation in the literature, in the reinforcement learning literature, which is the idea that what you're trying to maximize is something called empowerment. And in empowerment, it's also an information theoretic measure. But now, rather than just looking for information gain, what you're trying to do is maximize the mutual information between the things that you do, your actions, and their outcomes, at the same time that you're trying to produce as many variable actions as possible. So basically, what you're trying to do is find cases where you do something that changes, that's variable, and that lets you predict variability in the world outside you. So the technical term I like to use is you wiggle something, and then something out there in the world wiggles. All right? That's essentially what this idea is. So what you want to find is as many cases as you can. You're really happy if you wiggle something and something out in the world wiggles too. And that's what you want to do, is find as many examples as you can of that kind of mutual information. And of course, a way of thinking about that is that when you can do that, then you can control the world, right? Then you can actually make things happen out there in the world, independently, as we'll see in a minute, of whether they're any use to you or not, right? They might actually have negative utility, but you can make them happen. You can bring them about. An action can actually lead to these outcomes. And I think so what this does is it rewards exploration, especially if you think that empowerment gain, getting more of this empowerment, is the thing that you're really trying to accomplish. And it rewards you for discovering the most important things about your environment, right? Not just anything about your environment like the staticky TV, but all the things about your environment that will let you understand and control that environment in the future. And I think it's an interesting side note that this actually, the original work on this came out of evolutionary computation. So it actually was people, at Santa Fe who were trying to figure out, well, how could a creature evolve to be intelligent at all in the first place? And there's this wonderful biological fact, which is that you see this transition in the Great Cambrian explosion from creatures like these Ediacaran creatures that were quite complicated, big creatures that lived at the bottom of the ocean and just had this really happy, tranquil life where, plankton floated by and they extracted nutrients and they reproduced and nothing much else happened. That was millions of years. Those were the creatures that we had on Earth. And then suddenly you get this change in the Cambrian where you have creatures that have eyes and claws, creatures that have sensors and actuators that can perceive and can act. And once that happens, there's this great arms race among these different creatures because they start chasing each other. There start to be predators and prey, and you can go out and look for prey, and then you can use your claws to catch the prey, or you can use your claws to run away from the prey. And that's when you see brains. So brains start showing up, nervous systems start showing up when you get these Cambrian creatures that are coordinating action and perception. They're still very simple creatures, but they're already doing this thing of trying to organize action and perception. A side note is that philosophers like Peter Godfrey Smith have argued that consciousness starts to show up there. So I think there's something rather tragic about the fact that when we were happy little Ediacarans, we didn't know it, and we only started knowing it when we had pain and fear and hunger. That's when we actually started being conscious. And the idea is that empowerment is a very good way of coordinating those sensors and actuators. So if you go out trying to maximize empowerment, what you're doing is finding as many consistent relationships between your actions and their outcomes as you possibly can, and that's a way of being intelligent. That's a way of getting along in the world. And again, the idea is it's not that you're getting reward from that, but you're figuring out the relationships that would enable you to get reward in the long term. So if you figure out, when I move my head this way, here's how my visual field changes, you may not get reward right now, but if you're trying to avoid a predator, knowing that that's going to happen is going to be really important. Okay, now what I've been arguing, so a lot of people have started getting interested in this idea of empowerment. It's related to a lot of other interesting ideas like agency. But what I've been arguing is that I think this is very deeply, profoundly related to causal learning in particular. And if you look at the philosophical literature and the computational literature about causation, the sort of work of people like James Woodward, or famously Judea Pearl in the computational literature. The basic idea of what does it mean to be a causal relation, what makes causal relations different from, say, mere associations, is that if you have a causal relation, then if you intervene on the cause, you will get a change in the effect. So what it means on these computational views to be causal is exactly that if you wiggle the cause, the effect will wiggle. That variability, if you intervene in a way that changes the value of variable x, that will change the value of variable y. And importantly, that's different from just association and prediction. So to give another boomer example, if you see that someone has yellow nicotine-stained fingers, you can predict that they'll have lung cancer. There's an association. But if you intervene, if you do something to wash their hands, that's not going to make any difference. But if you intervene to stop them from smoking, it will make a difference in the probability of lung cancer. And that's the reason why something like an experiment, a randomized control trial, is the gold standard for causality. So causality and intervention are very closely connected to one another. The idea is that if you've got a causal relation, that means that if you wiggle the cause, something will happen in the effect. So I think that what that means from a sort of analytic philosophy perspective is that gaining empowerment is necessarily going to lead you to have more causal knowledge, and vice versa, gaining causal knowledge, like a causal model, is necessarily going to lead you to have more empowerment. So the two things are very deeply conceptually related. And a real big question now is how can we make a bridge between the formalisms that are involved in those two kinds of learning. But I think the conceptual link is really there. And moreover, I think that if you look at developmental psychology, there's a really strong empirical link between these two ideas. So are kids actually driven by this drive for empowerment gain? Well, interestingly, way back in the 70s, another advantage of being an old boomer, Carolyn Roby Collier and her colleagues did these beautiful experiments. And interestingly, it came because that was the first wave of reinforcement learning when it was operant conditioning. And Carolyn wanted to find out, could little babies be operantly conditioned? So what she did was she took a ribbon and tied the ribbon up to a crib mobile with the baby, and saw what happened. And what happened is 3-month-olds will start kicking at the ribbon. And not only, however, will they start kicking at the ribbon, but they'll stop kicking, and they'll look up at the mobile, and they'll try kicking their other foot, and they'll look up at the mobile, and then they'll kick their foot again, and then the most important thing, I think, is they'll start giggling. They'll giggle, they'll coo. After a little while, they aren't even looking at the mobile, and if you just make the mobile by itself, it's not really a great reward. And Carolyn, at the end of her review paper about this, said, it's funny, it's like the very contingency between the action and the outcome is the reward. That's the reward itself. In other words, the babies are being rewarded by empowerment gain. That's the definition of empowerment. And if you look out at one of the great things, again, about being a grandmother in 2025 is that you get wonderful, beautiful videos of your grandchild every morning, random videos. If you look at random videos of a 1-year-old, you will see this empowerment all the time. Now, maybe this is not a fair case, because this is Kit, who was actually my co-winner of the Rummelhart Award, as Julia said. But here's Kit, and Kit's grandfather is actually quite an accomplished musician. So he's playing the piano in the background, and he's given Kit this xylophone to play with. And what you can see is that Kit first tries with the rubber end, and then he tries with the stick end, and then he tries with his fat little hand, which is not going to make any noise at all. Then he tries with his fat little hand again. If he was just doing RL, you'd expect that once he realized that the mallet was working and other things wouldn't, he would just converge on the mallet. But he doesn't. He keeps trying to figure out, how about if I put the mallet higher up? How about if I put the mallet further back? And the result of this, interestingly, given his grandfather, is that he's learned a causal relationship between actions with your hands and pure tones, which could not be anything that was in core knowledge, that has not existed in the past in human history, but is nevertheless, for many of us, a really important causal relationship. And he's learned that just through this spontaneous just through this spontaneous play. And I think I'll just go through this quickly given time. What we've been doing is trying to show this more systematically. So I'll just point to a couple of different papers. You could actually go and find the papers themselves. In a first paper, what we did was put children and RL agents in a Minecraft environment, and we just said, just figure it out, just play, just explore. And what we discovered is that we could characterize the children's interventions were very much well characterized in terms of empowerment, better characterized in terms of seeking empowerment than something like seeking information gain. And you can look at the paper. This is a new paper that's about to come out in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, where we made this theoretical point about the relationship between causality and empowerment, but Eunice Yu, my wonderful doctoral student, actually designed a way of testing this empirically as well. And what she did was design these little star machines. These are machines that the elf boss wants you to make stars, and he's given you this choice of different machines to make the stars. So you can have a machine that's very reliable but isn't very variable. You can have a machine that is just produces random outputs, so you have a lot of information gain but not much empowerment. Or you can have an empowerment machine where there's a close relationship, a predictable relationship between your actions and outcomes. And both kids and adults understand that the empowerment machine is the one you want if you're going to make a new causal intervention. But again, I won't go into the details of that. And then this is the third example. This is with adults now, although we're doing it with children, where we used a kind of little alchemy design where you have to put things into the cauldron and then see what comes out. But this time we actually explicitly asked for causal predictions. So we said, what will happen if you put this combination in for a new combination, to see if people had inferred the right kind of causal structure. And again, what we did was we had 10 minutes where we said, just explore this, just figure it out, just play. And then we asked the causal questions. And what we found was that the degree of empowerment in the exploration predicted how good people were at the causal questions. So the degree to which they sought empowerment when they were just spontaneously exploring predicted how well they had appreciated the causal structure of the system and how good they were in answering the causal questions. Okay, let me segue over to care. Now, you may have noticed that so I think there's a whole lot of interesting work to be done empirically looking at how both children and agents might be using empowerment to maximize exploration. Now, one of the things that you probably noticed in that video with Kit was that the only thing that his grandfather said was, "Kit, don't put the stick in your mouth." And people who have small children who I've shown this video to are always sort of saying, "Oh, he's going to poke himself with that stick." And actually, the Wired magazine at one point asked for the best toys in the world, and the stick was number one. And a stick is like a fabulous empowerment device, right? A stick is a wonderful, wonderful empowerment device. It lets you make lots of variability in the environment based on the variability in your own actions in a somewhat unpredictable way, but a way that you can figure out. It also, as in the case of my grandchildren, can lead you to the ER. And that's part of the point about the negative utilities, right? So a stick can have very high empowerment, very good chance of negative utilities. And that gets to the point about care. In order to be able to solve that problem, you need to have, grandmom who's willing to drive you to the ER if you're going to be an effective stick user, not to mention feed you peanut butter sandwiches. This is one of my favorite experiments in all of psychology. I think it deserves to be much better known than it is. So let's go back to reinforcement learning, that really basic Psych 101 phenomenon of put the rat in the maze, it goes down one arm of the maze and nothing happens, it goes down the other arm of the maze and it gets shocked. It will never go down the arm of the maze that led to the shock. And that's like Psych 101 learning, avoidance learning. But it turns out that that's true for grown-up rats, but it's not true for juveniles. And Regina Sullivan found that if you put juvenile rats in the maze, they prefer the arm that leads to the shock. The arm that leads to the shock is empowering, right? It's giving them empowerment. It's giving them information, even though it's giving them this very negative reward. But there's a magnificent catch, which is that they'll only do that if the mother's present. In fact, if the aroma of the mother is present, if the mother's odor is present, then the rats will explore the information gain arm. If it isn't, then they'll act like the adult rats and avoid the negative shock. And brilliant Nim Tottenham showed that this was true with human 3- and 4-year-olds as well. She didn't shock them, but just they have an unpleasant noise. They'll choose the informational end, even though they really don't like the noise, if the caregiver is present. And that suggests that care is kind of complementary. In order to be able to have this exploration in childhood that's so important, you need to also have this other side, which is to have the care available to keep you from having all the negative consequences of your exploration. And that leads to this project that Julian and Julia have been involved in, and that we've been doing in a big interdisciplinary project we've been doing at the Center for Advanced Studies, about what's the cognitive science of care? What's the nature of care? We all know that caring for other people is one of the most important, morally profound, central things that any of us ever do. And it's hard. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of cognitive capacity to do it. And yet, you could look at the literature on political science, on economics, on cognition, on moral psychology, moral philosophy, and it's completely invisible. It's just not there. There was a little bit of feminist stuff in the 70s where feminists said, "How come this is invisible?" But that was kind of the end of the story. And my colleague Myrit Levy, who's been working on this project with me, and I, at one point said, "What is there anything in common about all the people who've been doing this for all these hundreds of years that might explain why they never thought about care?" And we decided it's because they're tall, so it's the tall people. And yet, when you think about caregiving, it's this incredibly compelling and interesting cognitive phenomenon. This is the picture that we used in Daedalus. I actually found this picture in Rotterdam when I went to get the Rumelhart Award. And I think this picture captures how strange caregiving is, because you can't really look at this picture without feeling the impulse to take care of that sick child, even though the sick child looks sick. I mean, that is really an unhappy child. And I find this even more moving when you know that this picture was actually made during an epidemic of plague in the 1600s in Holland. So that baby is not unlikely to die, and the mother and the painter who are taking care of her are all putting themselves at risk by caring for her. So we've tried to ameliorate the tall person problem, although there's a lot of tall people in here, by doing this social science of caregiving, trying to put together this interdisciplinary project to try and think about caregiving more deeply, and in particular to think about the cognitive science of caregiving. And that's become something really interesting and important. We're doing a workshop about it at the Cognitive Development Society. And to go back to life history, it turns out that just as a longer childhood is correlated with intelligence, more parental investment, more care is correlated with intelligence. So the larger brain an animal has, the more likely it is that there will be many adults who are invested in caring for the young. So this is the quokka and the Virginia possum. They're both marsupials this time. They're both about the same size. The little baby quokka stays in the pouch for about a year, and the possums are mature within a very short time. The quokkas only have one baby at a time. The possums have lots. And the mother possum is the only one who really takes care of the baby possums. The fathers are involved in taking care of the baby quokkas. And the baby quokkas are the brains of quokkas are twice as big as those of possums. If you look at humans, we have what I think of as the care triple threat. So along with our large brains and long childhood, we have a really extensive network of care. So we have pair bonding, which is very unusual. Only 5% of mammals have pair bonding, where fathers care for mothers and care for children. We have alloparents, We have non-kin who are involved in taking care of children. And we have that favorite of mine, the postmenopausal grandmothers. And there's a lot of beautiful work recently showing that postmenopausal grandmothers actually are responsible for survival of their grandchildren. So a postmenopausal grandmother makes a huge difference in the actual survival of the children. Let me mention, by the way, one of the things that's puzzling about the neglect of care is, we all know about evolutionary psychology, and there are all these sort of somewhat Dressot stories about how this adds to reproductive fitness. Well, care is the thing that makes a difference between whether your babies live or die. Like, you couldn't have a more obvious example of something that's really, really important from a perspective of fitness. And one of the other things that's interesting about humans is that not only do we have a much broader range of investment, but we extend that much more broadly. So not only do we invest in children, not only do we care for children, but we care for partners, we care for elders. In societal institutions, we're in relationships of care with our students. Doctors are in relationships of care with patients. Arguably, we care for non-human animals, and we care for all sentient beings and the planet. We have these kinds of relationships very broadly. And I think there's a good argument that our capacities for things like cooperation, again, a very distinctively human capacity, are not rooted, as one might think, in things like our tit-for-tat reciprocity social contracts. I think they're rooted in our capacities for care, and I can talk about that a little bit more later on. But care is very weird, and again, part of the reason why it may have been neglected is it's very weird from a cognitive science perspective. So if you think about it, just, this is just a kind of analytic psychology, again, an analytic philosophy kind of analysis. What happens when you have two agents who have different resources and different goals? Well, the classic story is that they have some kind of social contract. They have reciprocity, they have tit for tat, they exchange resources to accomplish each other's goals, and this is a really good thing, and that's kind of the story about cooperation in economics, in evolutionary psychology. But care doesn't really have that kind of contractual relationship. If you're caring, that example, you're caring for a dying child, right? There really isn't good, it isn't like what's going to happen is that child is then going to take care of you. And even if you're, taking care of just regular children, if you get an occasional affectionate text message once they're 14 or 15, you're doing really, really well as a caregiver. Or you might think, I'll skip over solidarity for a minute, but you might also think, okay, well, it's a power relationship. So A has more resources than B, and so B is going to subordinate their goals to A. Yeah. But it's not a power relationship with care either. So it's not that what happens, although you might think it would happen, is that you get your children to do everything that you want, right? Or for that matter, it's certainly not true with, say, your elderly parents. What happens in care is that A has more resources than B, and for that very reason, A is subordinating their goals to B. So what you do is the very fact that you see that child is so needy, or that elder, or that student, or that patient, that's the thing that leads you to want to try to accomplish their goals and use some of your resources to accomplish their goals. And one of the other kind of puzzles about this is, what exactly do you mean when you say that you're trying to accomplish their goals? And again, it could be that you're thinking about their objective utilities, like what will be best for them objectively. But a lot of times there's a real tension between that and the subjective utilities of the person you're caring for. This is very vivid if you're taking care of an elderly parent, for example. So the older father really wants to keep driving, and you really think that that's not in his interest. What should you do? What does it mean if you're a carer, or a teenager, or even a 2-year-old? How do you balance those things? And actually what I think is that the thing you're really trying to do in care, although you are sometimes trying to maximize the other utilities, is you're trying to maximize the recipient's empowerment. Again, in that technical sense I meant before. So what you're trying to do is put the recipient of your care in a position where they can decide on their own goals and accomplish their own goals. What you want is for them to have a certain kind of autonomy when they grow up so that you won't have to care for them anymore. And even in a case like elders, you want them to be as independent as they can be, right? That's part of what caring for them is. It's not caring for someone if you just go in and do everything for them. You want them to be able to have the capacities that will enable them to accomplish novel goals. And that's very much true for childhood. So I think you could think about this as, here's two agents. One agent is now not trying to maximize their own empowerment the way the children are in their exploration, but trying to maximize the empowerment of another agent. And I can talk about why I think that would be important in the long run. Okay, so my 2 slides about AI. One of the other things, I mentioned that there's one other species that we know of that has postmenopausal grandmothers, and that is the orcas, the killer whales. For years, I thought, orcas? Really? Okay. It turns out that orcas are one of the few species that has cultural transmission, so that the orca grandmothers are actually giving information about foraging from 20 or 30 years ago to their children and grandchildren. And the survival of the grandchildren depends on this information from the grandmothers. And if the grandmothers die, the pod doesn't do nearly as well because they don't have that information. And if you look at my favorite picture of the postmenopausal grandmothers and her grandchildren, what she's actually doing in that picture is reading a 100-year-old copy of Winnie the Pooh, because she happens to be a grandmother who likes collecting first editions of children's books. But that function of giving 100 years worth of knowledge to the grandchildren is actually something that you can show in forager cultures and in other places is very characteristic of elders. The poor parents are sitting there trying to put out the fires every day, but the grandparents are the ones who are talking about the big structures in the community and the culture. And my colleagues and I have argued that if you think about AI, what LLMs are actually doing is serving as technologies for that kind of cultural transmission. What LLMs do is act as a technology that lets you get information from one generation of people to another generation of people. So they're really, what you're doing when you do something with ChatGPT is asking grandma. That's essentially what you're doing. Probably you're better off asking grandma, but you're doing the same thing. You're saying, what have all the other people in the past thought about whatever this particular issue is? And then finally, I think, again, thinking about the AI context, so I argue that LLMs are not individual autonomous intelligent agents. They don't do the kind of exploration, et cetera, that humans do. But you could design agents that are like that. We actually know how to create agents that are like that, and it's much more fun than coding because, of course, we create babies all the time. But if you did have autonomous AI, one of the conceptual problems that people have talked about is what's called the alignment problem. How could you ever get them to have the same kinds of, how could you get them to have goals that were good, to do good things rather than bad things? And the typical way that this is done in the literature is what I think of, again, a bit of a boomer reference, is the Stepford wife solution to this, which is that you just get them to figure out what you want and then do what you want. You get your AIs to be sort of slaves who are figuring out what you want and then matching it. But I think what you really want would be to have systems that could figure out goals for themselves, but could figure out goals that are positive goals rather than negative goals. This beautiful story by Ted Chiang gives you an example of this. But of course, that's every time we have a child, we face this alignment problem. We don't want our children to just have exactly the same goals and practices. And throughout history, that's, again, part of a point of this exploratory function of childhood. But we want them to have good goals rather than bad goals. We want them to have goals that are relevant to the changing non-stationary environment that they're going to find themselves in after we're gone. And so I think if we solve the problem of care, what we really need for an AI to be intelligent is for it to have mothers, for it to have human mothers. And we would like that AI to be in a relationship of care to us. So if we want an AI to assist us, we don't want it to just do all the things that we do. We want it to give us powers to do things that are new, that are things that we haven't done before. Okay, so I've gone on too long. Let me just acknowledge the exploratory children, aka graduate students and postdocs, that I have mothered, and then what, at least in the ideal world, would be the caring foundations that provide us with the conditions to do the exploration that we have. And to a large extent, this is actually still true. And let me end there and take some questions.